please.
The Google Developer Day. My name is Greg Stein. I'm an engineering manager at Google. I'm responsible for our open source efforts, also for Google Gadgets. I'm going to talk today about why open source is important to us, what we're doing to promote open source, how that relates to our APIs, things like that. So, as Mies was saying, Google Developer Day is being held in 10 different countries around the world. Thousands of developers like yourselves are attending these sessions. The very first one was in Sydney. This is actually the second session as we move through the time zones around the world. Mountain View, where I work, our headquarters, is actually going to be one of the last ones presenting. But so this is actually, you guys are some of the first to see some of the things that we're talking about throughout the day, some of the new launches, some of the new products that we're announcing today. But I'm here mostly to talk about open source and our APIs and how those two relate. Back in 2002, one of the engineers, Nelson Minar, in his 20% time at Google, started a project to enable Google searches through a SOAP API. And he launched that, and that was the very first API that Google had way back in 2002. It was somewhat limited. You couldn't run many searches. The results were also limited for various reasons. But as we move forward in time, different APIs were launched, but we didn't do a whole lot with open source. And so Google wasn't very well known in the open source community until March of 2005. At that time, we launched the Google Code website. And that's about the time that I started working with Chris DeBona, my colleague, and we launched the site to promote some APIs, to launch some new software packages, and for a place where we could put source code for all the different packages that we were launching, and source code for the search appliance and the different things that we wanted to publish. It was a site for us to reach out to developers. At that time, 2 years ago, it was a very small site. It's very different from what we see today. Soon after we launched, we started a program called the Google Summer of Code. And that was a program that we used to bring students into open source, teach them what open source meant, teach them what a community of open source developers was about, and produce more open source code. And we started that in the year 2005 during the summer, and we ran it again last year in 2006, and it's just starting again this year. The students began their coding projects 2 days ago. So they submitted proposals and everything over the past couple of months, but they're now starting to code on those projects. One of the other things around the Google Code website that my team was responsible for was launching the project hosting. And that's where open source projects can put their source code, can put their documentation, can put all the different things related to their project on the Google Code website. Again, this is one of the things that we're doing to try and support the open source community. But if you look at this timeline, there's very few APIs that we launched years ago, but as you move forward in time, more and more and more APIs are being launched. And so today, later on, you'll hear about some of the newest APIs, but I'm going to talk about open source and why that matters. So today, the way that applications on the web are being built is you start with a number of open standards, whether those standards are HTTP or JavaScript or AJAX or HTML or XML. There's a set of standards. And people build some applications and services on those standards, But then you get things like mashups, where you take services from more than one company and pull those together. And this is kind of a new thing that has started up a few years ago, where it's more than just one person launching a single site, but you're drawing from many sites. And a lot of that is built around standards. It's built around APIs. A lot of these new applications are being funded by advertising revenue. A lot are funded by the Google advertising network, and that helps to create a revenue stream for some of these different new types of applications. A lot of this stuff is being built on open source. All the different services and the platforms that these are being run on, a lot of the grounding technology is open source based. And so building on all of this is sort of the new mode of application development, building on top of other people, mashing up, bringing things from multiple services to create a new application. So of course, I'm going to be concentrating on the open source part and why open source is important. And one of the first things that I'm going to talk about is an API called Sitemaps. And Sitemaps was launched by Google a while ago, and right from the start, we wanted it to be open source. So what Sitemaps does is it allows webmasters to describe the different pages on their site. Google can find a lot of web pages using our crawler, but sometimes on dynamic pages, we miss them. And so the Sitemaps API allows a site to say, here are all the different pages on my site. This is a very simple example here with just a list of each of the URLs. There's a more complex example. I'm sorry if you can't quite read that, but this shows a more complicated example where you can describe refresh times and when something last changed and how quickly that page should be crawled and other different characteristics. I'm not going to go into the actual details here, but you can see that there's more information here. It's not necessarily obvious. What are the formats that are used? What are the tags that are used? And so a specification was necessary for this. So what was the right way to launch an API like this? Well, the easy part was to provide some open source examples. How do you construct one of these files? How do you parse one of these files? The easy part was creating documentation to describe all of the tags, to describe the formats, to really tell people how are these files going to be used. But the harder part, the harder decision was, how do we put this in the hands of other people and get them to use this? I mean, if it was just another Google thing and people weren't sure that we were going to try and close it or have some control over it, what we wanted to do is provide it with a license to people that would give them some comfort. And so we turned to Creative Commons. Creative Commons is an organization that provides different licensing models for written material, for music, for different kinds of works of art. It doesn't apply very well to software, but it does apply very well to written specifications. And so we put the protocol specifications and the format specifications under a Creative Commons license. And so what this meant was that people could use this knowing that they had a proper license, that they weren't violating some Google proprietary thing, because we said under the Creative Commons, here you go, you can use this. And this was very unusual. Nobody else had really put any written material under a Creative Commons license. We were one of the first to do this around specifications, to make sure that people felt comfortable with what we were doing. So what happened? Well, we always felt that Sitemaps was always going to succeed. I mean, it was a great way for site operators to tell us more information about their site, how fast to refresh pages, where the pages were located, what we were supposed to do with those pages. And so we figured people were going to buy into this. But more people wanted to participate, and we wanted others to participate. And so what we did is we reached out. We tried to find a way to reach out to others, other search engines and other developers, people that were building content platforms, content management systems, whether they were building some kind of a dynamic publishing system, whatever it was, we wanted to reach out and engage those people to adopt this specification so that we could crawl those sites better. And so we figured, what if other people wanted to extend it? What if, say Microsoft or Yahoo had something particular to their search engine and they wanted to extend it? And we knew that that was going to happen, so why not make it explicit? Why not say, hey, all right, we have licensed this to you, but let's go one step further and really make it okay for you to add your extensions. So what we did is we got together with Microsoft and Yahoo and we constructed sitemaps.org. And that's a common place for all of us to work on the specification. And what happened is the three organizations, we created a new revision of it. It's still licensed under the Creative Commons license, and it's the next generation of these sitemaps. And now it's very popular. People are starting to put sitemaps on their websites. All three of the crawlers look for the sitemaps and use those to fine-tune their crawling technology. So all of this, if you go back, it's based on the fact that we started out with a Creative Commons license, that we looked at opening this up, looked at sharing it, looked at working with others, rather than trying to control it all ourselves. And that comes from our open source background and wanting to really sort of open these things up rather than to control them. So does this work for all APIs? Some it doesn't, but most of them it does. We've released a lot of documentation for our APIs. A lot of the ones that you'll hear about later, our GData APIs, our Maps APIs, they're all licensed under the Creative Commons license. Our example code for all these APIs, we put those under open source licenses. We want to make sure that everybody has access to these examples, that they can use the examples and incorporate those into their own software. And by putting them under an open source license, that gives those people an assurance that it's okay to incorporate those examples into what they're doing. One of the things that we are talking about now, and we're working with the Creative Commons organization, is to create a license that's specific to protocols. Because the protocol description is a written document, and you can license that written document under the Creative Commons license. But what about the actual bits that are on the wire, the protocol itself? Is there a way that you can license that protocol so that if, say, somebody reverse engineers the protocol and never looks at the specification, can you license the protocol itself and say, that's okay, you can use the protocol, you can use it under whatever terms you would like, and it's fair game, without looking at the specification document. So we're looking at ways to do that so that people are more comfortable working with protocols, and not simply just the specifications, but the protocols themselves. So why do we do this? I mean, number one is what's good for web developers ends up being good for Google. It's very important for us to have a very healthy environment out there among all of our developers. The more that they're doing, the more that they're improving the web, the more users that are using the web, the better it is for us. And so what we can do to help those developers will in turn help us, but also what those developers do will help users. Those developers are going to be creating new things, and that in turn is going to help users. So for us, putting the things that we do under an open source license, putting it under a Creative Commons license, is in turn good for web development and good for us. It's something that we want to continue to do to make sure that everybody can continue enhancing the web and bringing new products and new services to the web. One of the other very important things that we do when we're putting these things under licenses is to use very common licenses. Licenses that were built by and written by other people rather than something that we did ourselves. A long time ago, when Chris DeBone and I were first talking about what license should we use, what license should we prefer, the first thing we did was say, we will not create a Google-specific license. Because if we created a Google-specific license, then anybody that wanted to use our stuff would have to review that license. They'd have to say, well, what did Google do in this license? But if we say, we will use the Apache license, everyone already understands what that means. A lot of the community has already looked at that license, and they understand all the different meanings that are implicit in that agreement. And so we said right off, no Google license. And we will use the Apache license as our preferred license. There are certain cases when we will use the BSD license, and there are a few cases when we have used the GPL license. But the Apache license is our preferred license. But by using a standard and trusted one, that helps the community. It puts more trust in what's going on. The other thing is, by placing these things into open source and allowing these things to be built, it enables standards to be possible. When somebody writes a new standard and you come up with some examples or a reference implementation, those things should be placed under an open source license, so that if somebody wants to use that reference implementation, they can. They are licensed to do it. And so open source is at the heart of standards and vice versa. A lot of open source is built on those standards. It's a very symbiotic relationship. So publishing open source code. Now we have talked about publishing APIs and publishing specifications, but what about code itself? We publish a lot of different packages. There's a lot of code now hosted on the Google Code website. Not all of it is related to the APIs for our services. An excellent example of this is the Google Web Toolkit. The Google Web Toolkit is an independent package that allows you to help build your websites in a very easy manner. And it has nothing to do with this. You can use the Google Web Toolkit completely independent of Google and its services. And we've got a number of different packages on Google Code that are independent of our APIs. The reason that we publish a lot of this is because it actually doesn't hold a lot of strategic benefit for us. Our PageRank feature, that is beneficial to us. Our infrastructure, all of our computers and all of our data centers, that is beneficial to us. But code that helps you build a website is not really all that strategic. If somebody else can build a website better, that might actually help us. And so there's a lot of code at Google, I would say 80, 90% of the code that we've written that doesn't really matter if we share that with others. Yeah. That said, there is some benefit to sharing it, some strategic benefit to sharing some of this code. And that's what some of our APIs and our examples are about, is that we want to demonstrate our services, that we want people to see what our platform is about, see what tools we have, see what APIs and services we have. And so by sharing some of this code, it does actually give us some strategic benefit. But there is no benefit to keeping the code closed. There's a lot more by sharing it, and so that's what we want to do. So one of the other things about sharing code, and this is sort of a strange thing about open source communities. There are some communities of developers where they will give you the code and say, go do what you want with it. And they don't care, they don't ask for anything back. Feel free, have fun. There are others that say, we're giving you this code. If you're going to do something with it, please share back. Or if there's some other communities where they see a large company, such as Google, using a lot of open source code. I mean, we've got Linux installed on all of our servers. We've got GPL code running on all of our servers. We've got all kinds of open source, and we've built a very large business on open source code. And so some of those communities, they see Google using all this code, and they'll get angry if you don't give back. This applies to other people besides Google, but there are communities out there that want to see some kind of a gift back to the community, and to be sort of a good citizen and keep everybody happy. Google's participation in these open source communities makes them happier. And so, we're happy to do it. I mean, it works for us, and we do also feel a large debt of gratitude to all those people that have made our business possible, that have produced all of this open source code. So giving back is important. Giving back and working closely with communities is also very nice because they like you more. If, say, at some point we had a question about a software package, if we've worked with that community already, they'll be very happy to work closely with us and answer our questions. And so the more that we help them, the more that they will help us. There's a notion of goodwill there that if we are good to open source communities, if we make a mistake, if we do something wrong, they'll understand that's just human error and know that we are a good company and that we will fix it and make things right again. But if we weren't playing nicely, if we were not a good participant, we would not get that benefit. So one of the last things about publishing open source code and working with communities is finding out who the great engineers in those communities are. We've hired a lot of really, really talented and exceptional engineers out of these open source communities, because we know how those people interact in the community. We know the kind of code that they produce. We know how do they treat others. Are they producing good designs, things like that. And so we are able to hire a lot of people out of those communities. But what that also means is that when those people from the open source communities come to Google, they want to continue what they're doing. They want to continue publishing open source code. And so at Google, because we are happy to do it, it makes those engineers happy also. And so it all just kind of comes around on itself, and by hiring them, we contribute more back, we're happier, we make them happier, and we can hire more open source engineers that are very talented. So what I'm trying to say here is that, as a company, it's very, very beneficial to work with open source communities. You get more participation from them, more help from them. You can find more engineers. There's all kinds of benefits for working and publishing open source. Now, there's been a few things over the past 10 years that are very interesting about open source. The Linux and Apache really created today's web as we know it. 1995, Apache first came out. And at that point, Linux was somewhat working. But as each of these pieces came together, people said, wow, I can build a website by taking Apache and Linux. It's all free, and I can experiment. I can do anything that I want. And I see that guy over there is doing something really cool. I want to do the same on my website. Or I want to extend a feature this way or that way. And all of it was possible because this stuff was under a good license. And the two worked off of each other. The more people that wanted to build a website, they brought Linux to run Apache. And people, when they were working with Linux, they wanted Apache to do something with their new Linux server. And so open source made all this possible and created an environment where people were free to experiment, where people were willing to try out new things, where they were willing to try whole new business models. I mean, shopping on the web was not very well heard of until Linux and Apache came along and started companies like Amazon and eBay. And they really set the stage for entire new businesses that didn't exist in 1990. And it was the late 1990s, 1995 to 2000, when these kinds of things happened. And a lot of this is traced back to Linux and Apache and their open source licenses. Now, a lot of businesses failed, but some were successful. We see some very successful web-based businesses, and it's because of open source and how open source can dramatically change markets. So, two other packages that are changing the database market today, MySQL and Postgres. 10 years ago, you used Oracle. That's just what you did. Maybe if you ran Windows at your company, you might use Microsoft SQL Server. But those were your options. There were a few others, but nobody cared. It was Oracle or it was Microsoft. But today, people look at MySQL. MySQL is a viable option. It is changing the database market. And Oracle is starting to feel that pressure. Microsoft is starting to feel that pressure. When they go to try and sell their software, the companies they're trying to sell to say, well, I can just use MySQL. It's free. It has all the features that I need. Why should I pay you? And so then Microsoft and Oracle have to say, well, we'll give you a discount. How about that? And so it's affecting the pricing in the market. And the database market, as a result, is changing. These open source packages are getting all the features that these large enterprise packages like Oracle have been providing for years. And people that need it can now turn to these other packages. Firefox is really shaking up the web browser market. Internet Explorer hadn't changed in years. Microsoft had maybe 5 engineers producing security fixes. That's it. And then when Firefox started gaining market share and people started talking about Firefox and tabbed browsing was, all the interesting thing, Microsoft saw where this was going and they staffed their Internet Explorer team again. And now it's 100 engineers or something, and they released Internet Explorer 7, and the market is heating up again. Firefox is in there changing and leading the way for what web browsers mean. Now, over the next 5 years, there are going to be other disruptions. I don't know what they are, but something is going to come up and dramatically change the software industry, much like Linux and Apache and MySQL and Firefox have done. Open source has the capability to really change the software industry. So the market trend is definitely towards open source. There are these very large disruptions I talked about, but the general trend is towards open source, where software will be free. Most of the software that you use, you will not have to pay for. But what this does mean is the service industry and support industry is going to increase. As you use more open source software, and that software doesn't come with service and support, you will turn to others. And that's where the software industry is going to go, to companies like Red Hat or Source Labs, who will provide you the service and support. This trend towards open source is being pushed by developers. When developers produce software, and they look at 2 different packages, and if you have a package that you have to pay for, and you have one that's free, you'll take the one that's free. And so developers are really saying, this is what I want, and they're pushing in that direction. And so the companies that are charging are eventually going to not be able to charge because free ones will take their place. Now, even within open source, there's different kinds of licenses. And the package with the most permissive license, and by permissive, I mean the license that says, do what you want. You are permitted to do anything that you want with this. Don't try and say you wrote it, but you can change it, you can add to it, you can repackage it with something. All of that is fine. I permit you to do all this. So a permissive license is what developers prefer. They want to be able to do what they want with that software. And so all software is being pushed in that direction. Now, I do want to note that end users are not part of this. This is all driven by developers like yourselves. Your mom, your dad, they don't care whether it's Apache licensed or GPL licensed. They just want to use the code. But developers do care about these things. So Google, we want to follow this trend. The software industry is changing. We want to be right there with it. And so we see where it's going, and we want to continue to follow that. And so what we want to do is, knowing that open source is a building block towards what developers are doing, we want to be able to provide those building blocks so that people that are building applications can use our blocks, which then turn into our services, our APIs. The open source communities that we work with, we know that they are leading the way. They're shaping and defining standards. And so we want to work with those communities. Establishing relationships is very important because they are going to drive where the software industry heads. On all these APIs, on all these standards, it's being led by the open source community and the packages that they are building, the things that they are replacing with new open source equivalents. And so we want to follow in those footsteps, support that, and be part of that. So we can supply a lot of components and APIs, and developers can then build on that. They can leverage our scalable infrastructure. They can leverage our services. They can quickly add based on using things from us. You know, whether they need authentication, or they need some maps, or they need some kind of data storage system, we want to be able to provide all those different services so that developers can quickly build new functionality, and we can provide the infrastructure for that. What it also means is that developers are free to try different things, to take their creativity and experiment, try new applications, go in areas that we didn't think about, try out new business models, whatever it is. The developers can build on top of our stuff and build something new, build something different that we haven't seen, build something that's useful to users around the world. And for Google, our benefit is that we get more users. You know, we want to see more users on the web. And if developers are building on top of our infrastructure, using our services, using our functionality, using our open source code, and producing great stuff, then more users will be there using that great stuff. And we'll be there to also create a relationship with those users. So one of the other things is that Google reaches a lot of users. I mean, we've got millions and millions of people that come to our various properties every single day, every single week, every single month. And developers building on top of our stuff can then reach out to those users. Two of the best examples are Google Gadgets on the iGoogle page. If you create your own Google Gadget that is bringing your functionality, your data to the user, they can put that right on their home page along with the other things that are important to them. And so by creating that gadget, you can reach the millions and millions of people that use iGoogle. Just today, we launched a thing called Google Maplets to also create little gadgets on Google Maps. And so again, you can create a way for users, all those users that are using Google Maps, you can now provide functionality to them integrated right onto Google itself, right inside of our Google Maps. You don't have to try and bring people over to your website. You can instead leverage all the people that are already on our website by using these technologies. Of course, Google, we get the benefit of all of your creativity. You guys have thought of things that we haven't, and you guys can quickly iterate and go places that we might not be able to go as quickly. And so by bringing your functionality and your creativity into these spaces that interact with our users, it helps all of us. And again, next generation web applications. I mean, the model that I showed of the standards and mashups and ads and open source, all those pieces, it's creating a new way to build web applications. And we want to provide mechanisms to help support that. We want to provide the APIs and provide the data that you can use into mashups and other different types of new services. Your creativity, new business models, we want to be able to provide a way that you can do that on top of our stuff. So we provide a very scalable web-based platform for you to do this, that you can build new applications for your users. But even more importantly, this new platform gives people a way to bring standard applications like Google Docs and spreadsheets onto the web, where then you can access those applications from wherever you are. You can share those applications with other people, share your documents, have them indexed by Google so that they turn up in your queries when you're looking for that document. So Google Gears, this is also a new thing that we are just launching today as part of our Google Developer Day. Somebody's going to talk more about it a little bit later, but what I wanted to do is talk about how we are applying this notion of open source and openness to our new Google Gears product. So in short, Google Gears is a small little download. It's available for all the major web browsers, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Safari. And what this thing does is it adds storage capability. So a web application can store stuff on a user's computer. It increases JavaScript performance by enabling threading within the JavaScript interpreter. I don't know how many people know it, but in the web browsers, JavaScript is limited to one web page at a time. And so if one web page is consuming your JavaScript interpreter, your other web pages are very slow to respond. Through Google Gears, it allows multiple pages to use JavaScript at the same time. And then lastly, it also adds an offline capability. And it's this offline capability and storage that's really going to enable some creativity. So this, we think, is really the next step in evolution of the web browser, that enables new types of applications. The Google Gears, we decided we wanted everybody to be able to use this. We wanted to make sure that everybody could start to create new applications and just go wherever they want to. So we've licensed it under the BSD license. It's cross-platform. It's on all the different browsers. It's available on Windows, Linux, and the Macintosh. And the specifications around it, we are making those open also, so that if people want to create a different implementation, they can do that. So, based on our experience with why do we want to open everything? Well, this is why. We want to enable new types of applications, things we haven't thought about, things that you guys can bring your ideas to new users. And you can make your web applications offline. All these different web services that we're talking about, things where you're pulling data from different sites, you generally have to be online. But using Google Gears, you can move that to offline now. That you can squirrel some data, store some data on the user's machine so that if they disconnect and go traveling, they can still access all the data that you've pulled together and organized for them. So everybody benefits from this. By opening this up so that everybody can participate, so that everybody can build on this, all the users benefit from all the creativity that you guys can bring. You guys benefit because you can now reach out to new users. You can provide new services to those users that you couldn't before. You didn't have some of these capabilities, but now you do. Of course, for us, as I said, the more users there are on the web, the much better it is for Google. But hey, Google's a developer too. We have a lot of web applications, and we want those web applications to use Google Gears too. So today's talks, it's going to be covering, Mies went through some of this, but G-data, how we use that to make our APIs work, Google Gadgets, and then a variety of geo, Earth and spatial type things. The point behind all of these is that we are opening these APIs so that all these different services and capabilities are available to everybody to build on, that we can provide a platform for all of you to build on what we're doing. Thank you.